In this episode, we are setting up the formwork for the mezzanine and tower structure of the Home in the Earth project. We plan to use Shotcrete against these forms, so we need to only build one side. We like experimenting with different methods around here, so I decided to try forming the mezzanine wall with rigid XPS insulation. For this lower part, I'm using 1-inch XPS. The shape of the wall is defined by the floor track and then the vertical steel studs that will also hold the rebar and conduit later. The XPS is attached with 1.5-inch long self-tapping screws, but I also had to put lath on there to hold the screws in. Things started out a bit wonky, but straightened out when the steel studs were held plumb by 2x2 bracing. Here around the corner, we did something similar for the kitchen wall, but you can get a better look at the lath we used to hold the XPS on the steel studs. I used that wooden cross brace to plumb that center stud. This room was due to have a toroidal vault, like a donut vault. I decided it would be great if the steel arches that would support the ceiling were actually embedded in the concrete wall, so let's add them now. The only tricky bit was that I didn't have a full height steel stud lined up for each of the steel arches. I had to add a partial stud above the door, and then I ran rebar all along at the appropriate height, and then I could attach any extra steel arch to that. Here's a close-up of the outer side where the steel arches sat on a piece of angle iron in a concrete wall pocket. After making things plumb and trimming to fit, I did just a rough weld to hold things in place. The rest of the pocket will end up getting filled in by Shotcrete when we put the roof on. After getting the first 5 arches in and welding on both sides, I could suspend the last arch from that rebar rail we put up earlier. Again, this won't be holding any weight until the Shotcrete fills the wall and takes over as the primary structure. Here I want to pause to point out the curved PVC in this wall. This is just a stack vent to carry from the shower and the sink together up one stack vent. But my plumber told me you couldn't bend PVC, which I usually translate as do it yourself. But instead I actually had Michael do it. We marked out the curvature on a 2x12 board and screwed down some blocks to make the form. And then we used a $10 heat gun and gently forced the pipe into the curve. It only took about half an hour. Once the pipe cooled, we just slipped it through the holes in the steel studs. Easy peasy. We also kept that form board and reused it to check the rebar curvature right by the rebar bend. For all the rebar that's going in that wall, it has that same curve. I could just chuck it in, check it. Back to the wall, and you can see we're sliding in the rebar. It was all curved so that it would have no spring or tension against the wall. And then I did little spot welds to help stiffen the assembly. Those original vertical studs had actually been placed according to the second floor window locations. The window bucks were then simply carried up and screwed through the steel studs and into the wood. Here I switched to using green XPS from Lowe's simply because I happened to be there instead of at Home Depot. We were just filling up the space to get up to those steel arches, and I didn't want to try to puzzle my way around each of those little arches. Sherry is poking through extra wires and then tying them to the rebar on the other side. Continuing above the steel, I used a short piece here so that I could leave exactly 6 feet above this row, so that it would make nice easy math with the remaining insulation. Later we'll need to tape over that gap between the green strips to keep the Shotcrete from coming out and to give us that nice ledge that we want. But first, let's get some rebar across those steel arches. Welding significantly reduces the degrees of freedom and stiffens the whole assembly. This is all done now so we can build a deck up there so that we can more easily apply the top section of XPS formwork. Putting in that handrail makes us all feel safer working up there even if you never actually use it, and that speeds up the work. Continuing around the mezzanine, and I need to bridge the gap above the basement stairs. This is mostly made of treated scrap lumber and tapcons. I might as well toss in some vertical rebar while the scaffolding is here. Down on the ground, and we need to clearly define a corner for this wall. Again, scrap 2x12s left over from forming the garage footing made this pretty easy. This last bit of wood up high is for the walkway along the outside of this section. The upper part of the mezzanine forms an outer wall above ground, so we have to use more insulation. We're using 4 inches of XPS. Half of the boards are cut in half in each direction so that I can overlap the seams. The greater thickness of insulation meant I needed to get much longer screws. Those cost quite a lot in the big box stores, but I bought a bucket of 1,000 for $80 online. And these are also self-tapping as well. I also got a bucket of 1,000 lath washers for $36. So for less than 12 cents per combo, I was pretty happy. Here's a look at the back side of the wall. You can see the little treated wood blocks. And the whole time while I was on camera on the other side, Sherry, or one of the boys, was placing these little blocks on each screw as it came through. Here's a close-up. You can see that these 5-inch self-tapping screws had no problem biting into the steel studs. For the wood blocks, we had to pre-drill holes in them to keep them from splitting, and also to lower the torque on whoever was holding them. Here, Sherry is working on putting an electrical conduit on the other side, and she's also ready to hold the wood blocks for me whenever I need to put a screw through. After the XPS was all up and the curvature was all in place, I came back to cut openings for the windows. I tried a little hot wire cutting tool, but it was very slow, maybe not high powered enough. Here's some close-ups on the windows. In these pics you can see how the lath connected to the window bucks with screws. I did need to come back later actually and patch those corners with more lath so that the stucco would stick to it. Which reminds me, keep in mind that all this lath will end up covered by 3/4 inches of stucco. I cut the second window using the handsaw, and that was much faster than the hot wire cutting tool, and cheaper. I decided I could cut out the third window after the shotcrete was all in. I just put in a few extra screws right then and there so that later it would all work out. Actually, the original plans also called for a fourth window, a little further over to the right there, but Sherry decided she didn't want it. In addition to the mezz and tower, we wanted to sort out this little wall between the kitchen and the basement stairs. The formwork would be simple since we already had that concrete frame around the perimeter. We just needed to put some particle board across and stiffen it. And of course rebar on the other side. Then came the tower. Focus on that in a moment, but on the left my mother is cutting out the forms for my portal windows. These will be holes in the tower that will allow for airflow within the house from the radial vault ceilings in through that central tower and up through the solar chimney. More details about this design on the webpage, but basically they are 3 layers of rigid insulation, 2 circles and an ellipse glued together. We just traced out the plywood blanks onto the XPS and then cut it out with a bandsaw. We glued it all together with Gilding Gripper. It's a paint primer that special effects people and artists say is actually the best glue for XPS, and it also happens to be the cheapest and easiest to use. Back to the tower forms. The design was like a convex bookshelf. We attached wood strips to the steel pipes with self-tapping screws. Those things are great, I use them all the time. And then we cut out curved shelves out of the big pile of scrap 2x12s that we had lying around from the formwork for the footing. The back of the shelves, which is the actual form part that will be against the concrete, was particle board. And we attached that to the wood strips, and then we added the curved shelves to give it the exact right shape and to stiffen the forms. Basically we just continued like that all the way around, building shelves on this convex bookshelf. For the doorways, I'd extracted the shape of the top trim from the 3D model, so it would radiate outward just right to give the look that I wanted. Then we attached wood blocks to that floppy form so that we could attach it to the particle board later. On this backside of the kitchen wall, I wanted an opening in the concrete to slide a cupboard in through the wall under the spiral stairs that will go there. So I got David to make this sort of foam box we could easily knock out later. While he was working in this corner, I figured it was a good spot for me to also put in all the rebar. The second day of tower forms, and we need to get up to the second level. Things always get trickier when you're working off the ground. I started by working on the ring along the top of the concrete ribs, while my father and the kids worked on vertical bracing. Moving scaffolding around is always fun, but here we saved time by not carrying it all the way down, just passed it right over the wall. As each new section of formwork is placed, the vertical shape is controlled to make sure it's plumb, and the curved shelves make sure it's the right shape and curvature-wise. Easier said than done, but you get the idea. Filling the gaps between the ribs was the easiest part because it was such a nice stiff structure to work with. Here we are installing the south arched openings. Let's slow things down and show how the shelves are made. These will be for short shelves between the ribs, so we can use these narrow 2x4s. Michael just traces out the arc. Some people try to do it with string and all that. I find using a rigid member works so much better. And later he'll just cut them out with a jigsaw. Here's a short video of the assembly so far. You can tell that all these boards are recycled from forming the outer walls. Gray is actually the leftover concrete from last time they were used. We slide this segment of particle board in, and then Michael holds up his shelf piece for me. When I put the screw through, it pulls the board into the shape of that curve. The verticals are already plumbed, so once we add the curvature, we're all set. Pretty easy. Here's another high corner made with that 2x material. And then I can fill in that sidewall. And eventually the last form board goes in. Now it's time to set up those portholes. I use the Adir Pro laser to give me the level center line. Here's how it looks through my red glasses. You can see the laser much better. And then I use the ellipse form to trace them out. Some locations could be extracted from measurements, but the holes on the north side were to be opposite the south holes. So they were located by placing the laser on the floor, sideways, and then lining it up with the opposite hole. I had to keep rotating the scaffolding so the laser line would come up between the boards. The XPS forms were then attached through the wood with those long screws. Foam glue also helped a little. Now it's time for vertical rebar. These are just popped into holes that we drilled in the floor earlier. I decided that my door arch shapes were not strong enough to support the load, so I added those XPS pieces. I was able to just mark a perfect radius, no guessing required, no computer model, and then just slid that in there. Then back to horizontal rebar. Those blue Smurf tubes are electrical conduit. The single blue tube is 3/4 inch PEX for my water spigot on the roof. You can water the grass up there. There are also some red tubes for radiant heating up under the mezzanine floor. These PEX crimp connections are the easiest and best way to go. Don't mess with shark bite or anything else. Just get these PEX crimp connections. And then I tape over them to keep the concrete off the crimp rings. I'm not sure if that'll make them corrode or something, just better safe than sorry. putting up more rebar for the tower. I also had some basalt rebar that I wanted to try out, and this seemed like a good place. I really liked it for its lightweight and easy curving. I can see why it would be great for a pool where you are just forming against the earth. The earth provides the shape, you just have to, line rebar up along it. But it certainly didn't have many of the other qualities that made steel rebar useful for creating framework to hold up the formwork and concrete up in the air. But it worked in this case. I tried it out. It was great to work with. Here David is pulling electrical wires in the tower. Sherry's probably on the other side feeding it to him. This last little wall segment above the concrete arch was the last section of the mezzanine. Here I started with the rebar first to form the shape, and then I just hung the formwork, which was rigid insulation, from that. We passed our inspections by June 1st. This first long one is our structural inspection sheet. We had a new inspector this time and he was amazed what a long sheet it was. He spent a long time walking around looking at everything. And then this next one is my electrical inspection sheet. Again, also much longer than usual because I'm doing my electrical in small segments. Our original inspector was nice enough to sign us up for unlimited free inspections, so at least these don't cost me $75 for each line. It took all summer and the Shotcrete crew couldn't come out or didn't come out, so I thought, well, I might as well do a little bit more. And I also put in a formwork for the ceiling above the stairs, that way we can close that off completely. These arches are actually the cutouts from the bookshelves that we used to form the tower. Waste not, want not. I put down that plastic because I had no idea how long this formwork would need to wait before the Shotcrete came, which is good because it was more than 2 months. Of course, there were lots of other things to work on, and we'll have more on what we did while we were waiting for the next video, or you can click here to jump to the Shotcrete part.